War movies are everywhere, but let's be honest, most of them don't pass the smell test with the people who actually lived through the real thing. Hollywood loves big explosions and heroic speeches, but veterans care about details, tone, and whether the story rings true. So, which films do they respect? Which ones actually captured the grit of the European front? Stick around, because you might be surprised by what made the cut. Saving Private Ryan, 1998. Let's start with the one that pretty much redefined the modern war film. Steven Spielberg's Saving Private. Ryan didn't just throw viewers into the chaos of D-Day, it practically dragged them by the collar and dropped them in the surf. The opening sequence on Omaha Beach hit audiences like a punch to the chest. Veterans who had been there said it was the closest Hollywood ever came to showing what it actually felt like to step off those landing craft into sheer chaos. The brilliance of Saving Private Ryan isn't just the technical detail, though that's off the charts. Spielberg worked with military advisors to nail the sound, the uniforms, even the way soldiers moved across the sand. But what struck veterans hardest was the human side. The exhaustion, the fear, the gallows humor between brothers in arms. It wasn't glamorized, it was lived in. When Tom Hanks's Captain Miller looks at his men with that 1,000-yard stare, veterans said it felt like seeing a memory they never wanted to relive. And then there's the mission itself, finding one paratrooper whose brothers had all died. On the surface, it sounds like a story too neat for real life. But veterans understood the point. It wasn't about one soldier. It was about the impossible choices commanders had to make, the sacrifices of the many for the sake of the few, and the strange humanity buried inside war's machinery. For countless veterans, Saving Private Ryan wasn't just a film. It was validation, proof that their struggles weren't forgotten. No wonder it set the gold standard for every war film that came after. Band of Brothers 2001. Now, some folks will say I'm cheating by including this one, since technically it's a mini-series, not a movie. But ask veterans, and they'll tell you straight. Band of Brothers deserves its spot on any list about war stories done right. Across 10 episodes, it tracks Easy Company of the 101st Airborne Division, from training in Georgia to parachuting into Normandy and fighting through the Ardennes. By the time the series ends in Austria, you feel like you've lived every step alongside them. What separates Band of Brothers from so many glossy Hollywood productions is its obsession with authenticity. The creators didn't just consult history books, they brought in the surviving members of Easy Company. Real veterans sat down with the cast, shared their stories, and corrected the smallest of details. Even the actors admitted they felt the weight of responsibility. When you're playing a man who actually lived it, there's no room for phony dramatics. The series doesn't sugarcoat anything. You see freezing soldiers in foxholes during the Battle of the Bulge. You see fear, doubt, and the little acts of courage that carried them through. Veterans praised the way it captured not just the fighting, but the brotherhood, the sense that these men became a family forged by fire. The show closes with interviews from the real veterans themselves, which makes it all hit even harder. For many, Band of Brothers became more than entertainment. Teachers used it in classrooms. Military units showed it in training. Families of veterans said it finally helped them understand what their fathers or grandfathers had endured. That's not just storytelling, that's history brought to life. So while it might not be a movie in the strictest sense, Band of Brothers earns its place here, because sometimes the truth needs more than 2 hours to be told. The Longest Day, 1962. Before Saving Private Ryan showed us the chaos of D-Day with modern grit, The Longest Day delivered its own massive take on the Normandy invasion. Released in 1962, it was an old-school epic, shot in black and white, with just about every major star of the era packed into the cast. John Wayne, Robert Mitchum, Richard Burton, Sean Connery, Henry Fonda. The roster looks like a roll call of Hollywood royalty. But this wasn't just about big names. The filmmakers went all out to get the history right. Producer Daryl F. Zanuck poured resources into accuracy, hiring historians from both the Allied and German sides to ensure every detail matched the reality of June 6, 1944. Real locations were used whenever possible, and military consultants were brought in to supervise everything from uniforms to tactics. Veterans loved that it didn't just focus on the Americans storming Omaha Beach. It gave equal weight to British, Canadian, French resistance, and even German perspectives, showing the sheer scale of the invasion. Critics at the time noted how the film sometimes felt like a parade of stars, but veterans saw something more. They saw respect. They saw the attempt to portray D-Day not as a Hollywood spectacle, but as a turning point in human history. One veteran famously remarked that watching the film felt like flipping through a photo album of that day, each sequence capturing a moment frozen in time. Sure, The Longest Day doesn't have the raw intensity of Spielberg's version decades later, but for its era, it was groundbreaking. It's still recommended by veterans because it captures the planning, the scale, and the multinational effort that made D-Day succeed. It's not just a movie, it's a time capsule of respect. A Bridge Too Far, 1977. If The Longest Day was about one of the Allies' greatest victories, A Bridge Too Far told the story of one of their biggest blunders. Based on Operation Market Garden, the ambitious but doomed attempt to seize bridges. In the Netherlands in 1944, the film is as sprawling and ambitious as the operation itself. With a cast that included Robert Redford, Sean Connery, Anthony Hopkins, Gene Hackman, and James Caan, it promised spectacle. But what veterans valued was its brutal honesty. Operation Market Garden was a disaster. Thousands of paratroopers were dropped behind enemy lines, expecting relief that never came. Supplies were cut off. Bridges that were supposed to be taken in hours became battlefields that dragged on for days. The mission failed, and the Allies were forced to pull back. For once, Hollywood didn't dress it up as a hidden victory. A Bridge Too Far showed the failure for what it was. When it premiered, critics weren't impressed. Roger Ebert even slammed it for being bloated and overstuffed. But veterans had a different view. They saw a film that refused to play cheerleader. It showed soldiers fighting against impossible odds, leaders making desperate choices, and the human cost of overconfidence. Many veterans who fought in Europe said it was the rare film that dared to show that sometimes bravery isn't enough. It might be long, and it might feel heavy, but A Bridge Too Far is remembered for telling the truth. In war, not every plan works. Not every mission is a triumph. And sometimes, courage leads straight into heartbreak. That's why veterans still respect it. Patton, 1970. You can't talk about the European front without talking about General George S. Patton, and you can't talk about Patton without talking about George C. Scott. His performance in the 1970 biopic is legendary, right from that opening scene where he gives a rallying speech in front of a giant American flag. It's brash, it's unapologetic, and it set the tone for one of the most iconic war films ever made. What makes Patton special isn't just Scott's towering performance, though that's unforgettable. It's that the film didn't shy away from the contradictions of the man himself. Patton was brilliant and bold, but he was also volatile, egotistical, and sometimes reckless. The movie doesn't present him as a flawless hero. It presents him as a complicated figure whose strengths and flaws were equally larger than life. Veterans respected that honesty. They knew commanders weren't perfect, and seeing that on screen felt authentic. The film won 7 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Actor. But George C. Scott famously refused his award, saying acting shouldn't be a competition. That only added to the movie's mystique. Meanwhile, President Nixon reportedly screened it multiple times at the White House, making it one of the most politically famous films of its era. For veterans, Patton struck a chord because it captured the essence of leadership during wartime, the burden of decisions that affected thousands of lives, the pressure to succeed at all costs, and the personality clashes that shaped history. It's not a film about battles as much as it is about the man who drove them forward, and in that sense, it got it exactly right. The Great Escape, 1963. If there's one war film that almost everyone has heard of, even if they've never watched a single minute, it's The Great Escape. Steve McQueen revving that motorcycle and launching into his legendary jump. That image alone has lived rent-free in pop culture for decades. But beyond the Hollywood flair, this film is rooted in a true story. The daring breakout of Allied prisoners from a German camp during World War II. Of course, the filmmakers took their liberties. McQueen's motorcycle chase never happened in real life, but veterans never minded. Why? Because the movie got the spirit right. It showed the patience, the planning, the endless digging of tunnels under brutal conditions, and the way hundreds of prisoners worked together like a machine. Veterans who had been POWs said the film captured the boredom, the frustration, and the ingenuity it took just to survive, and then to outsmart their captors. The cast is stacked. Besides McQueen, you've got James Garner, Charles Bronson, and Richard Attenborough. Each character represents a real type of prisoner: the forger, the scrounger, the tunneler. It's a tribute to teamwork under impossible odds. Veterans especially loved that the film celebrated not just action, but cleverness. It was about brains as much as bravery. The real breakout didn't end as triumphantly as Hollywood painted it. Many of the men were recaptured. But the fact that they dared at all became a legend. The Great Escape turned that legend into a story that inspired generations. For veterans, it wasn't about accuracy down to the last detail. It was about honoring the courage it took to risk everything for freedom. And on that front, the film absolutely nailed it. Stalag 17, 1953. Now let's talk about a war movie that blends grit with wit in a way few others dared. Billy Wilder's Stalag 17 is set in a German prisoner of war camp, but it isn't just another escape story. Instead, it's about suspicion, betrayal, and survival. Loosely based on real accounts from former POWs, the film follows a group of American airmen who suspect one of their own is leaking information to the Germans. William Holden stars as Sefton, a cynical, sharp-tongued prisoner who runs the camp's black market. He's the kind of guy everyone loves to hate, so when an escape attempt goes wrong and 2 men die, Sefton becomes the obvious suspect. What follows is part thriller, part character study, and part dark comedy, a mix that shouldn't work, but absolutely does. Veterans praised the movie because it captured the mental side of being a prisoner. Not just the hunger or the cold, but the paranoia, the mistrust, and the way men turned on each other under stress. Holden's Oscar-winning performance nailed the feeling of being caught between cynicism and loyalty. The humor kept it human, but the tension kept it painfully real. What makes Stalag 17 stand out even today is its honesty. It's not about big heroics. It's about endurance and the razor-thin line between survival and betrayal. Veterans who'd lived through POW camps said Wilder understood the atmosphere better than almost anyone, and maybe that's because he fled Nazi Germany himself. Whatever the reason, Stalag 17 remains one of the most respected prisoner of war films ever made. Battle of Britain, 1969. Some war films lean on spectacle, but Battle of Britain went for something else: authenticity. Released in 1969, it brought to life the desperate summer of 1940, when the Royal Air Force held off the German Luftwaffe and prevented an invasion of Britain. Critics at the time were lukewarm, but veterans who had flown in those skies knew the film had gotten it right. Director Guy Hamilton didn't rely on models or stock footage. Instead, the production hunted down actual Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Messerschmitts, restored and flown by real pilots, some of them veterans of the conflict itself. That meant the dogfights on screen weren't trick photography. They were filmed in the air, with real planes banking, diving, and firing across the English countryside. For veterans, that alone made the film priceless. The cast was another highlight: Michael Caine, Laurence Olivier, Robert Shaw, Christopher Plummer. The film pulled in heavyweights to portray both the high command and the young pilots who carried the fight. The story doesn't shy away from the losses either. Squadrons get decimated, pilots vanish in smoke. It reminds the audience that victory came at a staggering cost. While it didn't win over everyone in 1969, time has been kind to Battle of Britain. Veterans and historians have since praised its attention to detail, from the cockpit layouts to the tactics. More importantly, they said it captured the tension of being outnumbered, outgunned, and still refusing to back down. The movie may have stumbled at the box office, but for those who were actually there, it stood tall as a rare tribute that felt true. Battleground, 1949. By the late 1940s, audiences weren't exactly clamoring for more war films. The memories were too fresh, the wounds too raw. But MGM took a gamble with Battleground, a movie about the Battle of the Bulge, and it ended up reigniting the entire genre. Directed by William Wellman, himself a veteran of World War I, the film follows a squad from the 101st Airborne Division trapped in the freezing woods of Bastogne. What made Battleground different was its focus on the everyday soldier. Instead of polished speeches and glamorous heroes, you got guys trudging through snow, scrounging for food, and cracking jokes just to keep from breaking. The film lingers on small details, mud-caked boots, frostbitten fingers, the endless wait for relief that veterans said rang painfully true. For them, it wasn't about big explosions or sweeping strategy. It was about endurance. The movie was a hit, winning 2 Oscars and pulling in audiences who thought they were done with war stories. But more importantly, veterans connected with it. They saw their own camaraderie on screen, the unspoken bond between men who knew their lives depended on each other. Decades later, even Steven Spielberg credited Battleground as a formative influence on his decision to make Saving Private Ryan. For veterans, the film was validation. It didn't paint them as invincible or saintly. It showed them as human beings, scared, cold, hungry, but determined. And sometimes, that's the truest way to honor their experience. Downfall 2004. War movies usually focus on the Allied perspective, but Downfall turned the camera inside Hitler's bunker during the final days of the Third Reich. Released in 2004, this German film shocked audiences with its unflinching honesty. Bruno Ganz's performance as Hitler is chilling. Not because it glorifies him, but because it strips away the myth and shows the pathetic reality of a man unraveling as his empire collapses. The film is based on the memoirs of Traudl Junge, Hitler's secretary, who witnessed those final days firsthand. Through her eyes, we see the claustrophobic chaos, generals bickering, families in denial, and civilians trapped in a city being torn apart. There are no rousing speeches, no Hollywood polish, just a slow-motion collapse into madness and despair. Veterans respected Downfall because it dared to humanize without excusing. It showed the enemy not as faceless monsters, but as flawed people clinging to delusion. That perspective made the victory of the Allies feel even more meaningful. It reminded viewers that the end of the war wasn't just a headline, it was the crumbling of a regime that had terrorized the world. The film sparked debates worldwide, especially because clips of Ganz's intense performance spread across the internet in parodies. But for veterans and historians, the takeaway was clear. Downfall wasn't about sympathy, it was about accuracy. And it succeeded in showing how evil often ends, not with glory, but with collapse. Dunkirk, 2017. Christopher Nolan isn't usually known for war films. He's the guy behind Inception and The Dark Knight. But with Dunkirk, he proved he could capture history with the same precision he used for science fiction blockbusters. Released in 2017, Dunkirk tells the story of the 1940 evacuation, where hundreds of thousands of British and French soldiers were trapped on the beaches while enemy forces closed in. What made Dunkirk unique was its structure. Nolan told the story through 3 timelines, one on the beach, one in the air, and one at sea. The result was a tense, almost suffocating experience. You never get comfortable because the clock is always ticking. For veterans and historians, that pressure felt authentic. The evacuation wasn't about flashy battles. It was about waiting, hoping, and holding out just long enough to escape. The film also used practical effects wherever possible. Real ships, real planes, real beaches. Nolan avoided digital shortcuts, which gave the movie a raw, grounded texture. Combined with Hans Zimmer's relentless score, the whole thing felt like one long heartbeat, pounding in your chest. Veterans appreciated that Dunkirk didn't turn the story into a victory parade. It was about survival, plain and simple. Ordinary civilians crossing the channel in fishing boats and yachts became the unlikely heroes. In its restraint, Dunkirk captured the quiet courage of people who didn't think of themselves as heroes at all. The Pianist, 2002. Not every war film is about soldiers on the battlefield. The Pianist, directed by Roman Polanski in 2002, focuses on survival in Warsaw during the Nazi occupation. Based on the memoir of Polish pianist Władysław Szpilman, the film follows his desperate journey to stay alive as the city around him is destroyed. Adrian Brody, who won an Oscar for his performance, brings Szpilman's story to life with heartbreaking simplicity. There are no grand battles here, no sweeping charges across open fields. Instead, we watch one man hide in bombed-out buildings, scavenge for scraps of food, and cling to his music as the only reminder of his humanity. For veterans and survivors, The Pianist was powerful because it told the story of war from the perspective of those caught in its shadow. Soldiers fight, yes, but civilians endure in ways that are just as brutal. The film doesn't sensationalize, it observes, and that quiet observation makes it devastating. Polanski himself lived through the Warsaw Ghetto as a child, which gave the film an added layer of authenticity. Veterans and historians praised it for being unflinching, yet respectful, capturing the cruelty of occupation without turning it into spectacle. The Pianist reminds viewers that war isn't only about generals and battle plans, it's about individuals trying to hold on to life in a world collapsing around them. And that's a truth veterans say Hollywood often forgets. So there you have it, 12 war films that veterans themselves say got it right on the European front. Some are big epics with star-studded casts. Others are intimate portraits of survival, but all of them earn respect because they don't fake it. They show the grit, the mistakes, the humanity, and the endurance that defined a generation. Which of these films hit you the hardest? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into history on screen.